Hi, I'm Bill with American Heritage Properties. I often get the question from potential clients and friends, real estate agents, do I really need to hire a property manager? And I answer that question with several questions. First of all, do you have the time and the expertise to market the property and show the property yourself? Do you have the knowledge to screen tenants and the resources to do that? Do you know what to look for on a rental application to determine the credibility of a prospective tenant? There's quite a few things to consider just in that aspect alone. Once you have a prospective tenant that you think is qualified, do you know what to include in the lease to make sure that you're protected, that your property's protected, your investment's protected? Do you know what to document in the property prior to the tenant moving in? What type of inspection to do, what things to write down, what pictures to take, what the process should be. When the tenant's there, are you going to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for emergencies or for maintenance, things that happen to come up? And speaking of maintenance, do you know how to properly respond to maintenance? Maintenance requests the tenant will have during the tenancy. Which things are important, which things are not? For example, tenants sometimes ask for sometimes silly things, and sometimes they ask for things that are habitability related. So it's important that as a landlord, you know how to differentiate between somebody that is asking for just way too many things that are unnecessary and things that are really important and that you as a landlord have a legal responsibility to maintain. Next, do you know what to do if the tenant is late with the rent? How do you respond to that? What's the best method to encourage the tenant to pay timely? And then what if the tenant stops paying rent completely? What's your first step? What's your second step? Third step? What's your plan if the worst case scenario happens to come up? What if the tenant causes problems during their tenancy? If they are breaking the lease terms, maybe disturbing neighbors or not maintaining the property well, what are you going to do in that case? What's the first step? What's the second step? The third step again? These things are important to know. And then what if the tenant happens to move out early? What are your legal responsibilities? How should you handle that if a tenant moves out early? I would say about 5% of leases end early because a tenant moves out because of a job transfer or they buy a home, sometimes a military transfer. How do you handle a military transfer? Is it different than any other transfer? Well, it happens to be, and there's a big difference there. When a tenant moves out, though, how do you handle the move-out process? Are you aware of the requirements of the pre-move-out inspection? When they do move out, how do you handle receiving possession back, doing the move-out inspection? Do you know what to charge? What's reasonable? There actually is no book that tells you what is reasonable, what's normal wear and tear, what's not, what you're able to charge, what you're not. But I tell you one thing, you're held to a very high standard when it comes to making those charges. Actually, the whole landlording process, you're held to a very high standard. You're considered to be the professional, regardless of whether you have one property or 1,000. And you're held to that standard in court where tenants, honestly, they actually aren't held to a very high standard at all. So you have a lot of accountability for your actions and responsibilities in handling the landlording side of your investment. And when you're speaking of your investment, do you know how much to charge for rent? Now, I know a lot of people, they look online, they'll look at Craig's, they'll look at Zillow or Trulia, and they'll come up with an idea of what the rent should be, or they'll say this is what it should rent for. Well, we rent about 350 properties a year, and we have a pretty good idea of what rents are, but even with us, it's not a science. You can't say for certain what a property will rent for. But what's important is that you have it priced at what you can attract a quality tenant in a reasonable amount of time, not just what you might find on Zillow, Trulia, or Craigslist, because people can list their property for whatever they want in those areas. So they're not necessarily good comps to use when it comes to knowing for certain what your property will rent for. It's a good guideline, and we use it ourselves, but it isn't something you can use as a sole basis for determining value. Can you make decisions based solely on business as opposed to emotional or personal? This is actually the biggest question I have for clients. And In my 27 years of property management, this is the biggest mistake I see people make, is that they let their personal or emotional thoughts influence business decisions. It might start with something like selection of a tenant. You have somebody that comes to you with a really good story, actually probably a really sad story, about what their situation is, where they have really bad credit because of an accident, for instance. They have no landlord reference because they've been living with family. Their income, you can't verify it because they're just switching jobs, but they really need a home, and maybe they say, are you a Christian? Can you help out another Christian? They use a variety of different methods to get into your home. But what's important is, regardless of what the person's story is, that you keep it business, that you review their application and make decisions based solely on business. That's what we do here. And that's a really important aspect of it. So that's just one aspect. Lease renewals, property inspections, all of these things have to be done from a complete business perspective. So if you answer yes to all these questions, that you're able to do all those things yourself, then you really don't need a property manager. But one thing that's important, even if you answer yes to all these, make sure you stay on top of the laws as they're changing every year. Because the laws, the judges, they expect you to always know exactly what the law is and always to be accountable for the details. So anyway, these are just a few questions that I've come up with over the years to ask potential clients or real estate agents, friends that are considering managing for themselves, just to give them a few things to think about and a few areas to investigate if they want to manage for themselves. I'm Bill with American Heritage Properties, and I'm happy to answer your questions. You can call me anytime.